The bustling streets of New York City are never short of stories. Each person passing by carries a world of their own, often unnoticed by the masses. On one particular afternoon, the usual chaos of honking cars, hurried footsteps, and street vendors was interrupted by a chilling shout that cut through the noise. "Don't drive," a young girl's voice cried out, startling those nearby. Her tone wasn't just loud, it was desperate, almost pleading. She stood at the edge of the sidewalk, her tiny frame dwarfed by the towering skyscrapers around her. Dressed in clothes that seemed too thin for the chilly weather, she was clearly a beggar, someone most passers-by would typically ignore or avoid. Yet, there was something about her urgency that made people stop in their tracks. Among those who froze was Melania Trump. She had just stepped into a sleek black SUV, her demeanor as composed and graceful as always. Known for her poise, Melania rarely reacted to the unexpected. But something about the girl's voice, or perhaps her eyes, caught her attention. It was a look that carried both fear and determination, as if the child knew something that no one else did. The security team, well-trained and vigilant, quickly moved into action. "Everything okay, ma'am?" one of them asked, their eyes scanning the crowd for potential threats. Melania nodded, though her gaze lingered on the girl, who was now running toward the vehicle. It wasn't a threatening sprint but rather a frantic one, as though she was racing against time. "Please don't drive that car," the girl shouted again, her words trembling but clear. The bystanders murmured among themselves, some pulling out their phones to record the unusual scene. What could a beggar girl possibly know about the luxurious SUV of one of the world's most recognized women? It seemed absurd, yet the conviction in her voice made it impossible to dismiss her completely. "Stop her," one of the agents instructed another, moving swiftly toward the girl. But before they could reach her, Melania held up a hand. "Wait," she said, her voice calm yet firm. It wasn't every day that someone so boldly disrupted her routine, and she was curious, perhaps even concerned about what the girl had to say. The little girl stopped just a few feet away, breathing heavily. Her face was flushed from running, and tears welled in her eyes. "Please, you have to listen to me," she begged, her voice cracking. "There's something wrong with that car. You can't drive it." The security team exchanged skeptical glances, their instincts telling them this was likely some form of a stunt or misunderstanding. But Melania, ever the observer, noticed the trembling hands of the girl and the way she kept glancing at the vehicle. There was no malice in her eyes, only pure, unfiltered fear. "What's your name?" Melania asked, her voice gentle but probing. The girl hesitated, as though debating whether to reveal this piece of herself. "Lila," she finally said. "Please, ma'am. I know I'm just a beggar, but I'm not lying. You have to believe me." By now, the crowd had grown, curious onlookers gathering to witness the interaction. Some whispered theories, while others merely watched, captivated by the unfolding drama. Lila's desperation was palpable, and it created an air of suspense that left everyone hanging on her every word. Melania stepped out of the vehicle, an action that caused a ripple of unease among her security detail. They surrounded her instantly, forming a protective circle. But she waved them off, signaling she wanted to handle this herself. Kneeling slightly to meet the girl's eyes, she asked, "Why do you say there's something wrong with the car?" Lila glanced nervously at the agents, then back at Melania. I can't explain it," she stammered. "But I saw someone near the car earlier, doing something to it. I don't know what, but it didn't look right. You just have to check. Please." The skepticism in the air was thick. After all, how likely was it that a random child, one who didn't even have a place to call home, had stumbled upon something sinister involving Melania Trump's vehicle? And yet, the sincerity in Lila's voice was undeniable. It was the kind of raw honesty that's hard to fake, especially for someone so young. "Ma'am, we'll inspect the vehicle," one of the agents said, still visibly doubtful. Melania nodded, standing up and stepping back. Her expression was unreadable, but there was a tension in her posture, a subtle sign that the girl's words had struck a chord. The agents began a thorough check of the SUV, their movements swift and practiced. The crowd watched with bated breath, the atmosphere thick with anticipation. Meanwhile, Lila stood off to the side, wringing her hands and shifting nervously from foot to foot. She looked as though she was carrying the weight of the world on her small shoulders. Minutes felt like hours as the agents worked, inspecting every inch of the car. And then it happened. A sudden pause in their movements, followed by a hushed exchange between two of them. One of the agents stepped away, speaking into a radio with a sense of urgency that hadn't been there before. The air seemed to shift. Whatever they had found, it wasn't nothing. Melania's calm demeanor faltered for the briefest moment, replaced by a flicker of worry. The crowd sensed the change too, their murmurs growing louder. "What is it?" Melania asked, her voice steady but tinged with concern. The lead agent hesitated, glancing at her before answering. "Ma'am, we found something unusual. We're not sure what it is yet, but it's enough to warrant further investigation." A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. Lila, who had been watching with wide, anxious eyes, let out a shaky breath. "I told you," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. For a moment, everything seemed to stand still. Melania turned to the girl, her expression a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. "Thank you, Lila," she said softly, the sincerity in her voice unmistakable. But before anyone could ask further questions or piece together the mystery, the agents moved to secure the area, urging Melania and the crowd to step back. And just like that, the scene was cloaked in even more mystery. What had the agents discovered? How had a young beggar girl, unnoticed by the world, come to know about it? And most importantly, what would happen next? The answers, it seemed, would have to wait. But one thing was certain. This was no ordinary afternoon. And Lila was no ordinary girl. The crowd began to disperse reluctantly as the security team pushed them farther back, creating a barrier between the SUV and the growing sea of curious onlookers. There was an air of unspoken questions lingering between those who remained nearby, whispering to each other in hushed tones. People speculated wildly, but no one knew the truth. Only one person seemed to have the slightest clue: the little girl who had sounded the alarm. Lila stood to the side, shifting uncomfortably under the weight of the attention she'd drawn. Her small hands clenched the hem of her worn sweater, and she avoided the gaze of anyone who tried to look her way. For a moment, her bravery seemed to falter. She had done what she thought was right, but now she was overwhelmed by the sheer size of the scene she created. Melania Trump, on the other hand, watched the girl closely. There was something haunting about Lila's expression, an unspoken story that clung to her every word and action. It wasn't just fear. It was deeper, more complex, as though she had seen more than a child her age should ever witness. "Lila," Melania said softly, stepping toward her. Despite the chaos surrounding them, her voice carried a sense of calm that cut through the noise. The girl's head snapped up at the sound of her name, her big brown eyes meeting Melania's with a mix of hesitation and relief. "Can you tell me what happened? What did you see?" Melania asked. Her tone was careful, not pressing too hard but encouraging the girl to open up. Lila hesitated, glancing at the agents who were now huddled around the SUV. One of them had pulled out what looked like a black device, their faces grim as they examined it. The scene was tense, but no one had given her any explanation yet, not that she expected one. "I was just walking," Lila said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I go around looking for things, scraps or stuff people throw away. Sometimes people give me food or coins, but most don't even look at me." She paused, swallowing hard. "That's when I saw him." Melania's brows furrowed slightly. "Him? Who do you mean?" "There was a man," Lila said, her words tumbling out in a rush now that she had started. "He was wearing a dark jacket, and he kept looking around like he didn't want anyone to see him. I thought he was just some guy at first, but then he got close to your car. He crouched down near the back wheel, and he was doing something with his hands. I couldn't see everything, but it looked like he was sticking something underneath." Melania exchanged a glance with one of her security agents, who had moved closer to listen. The man's expression didn't betray much, but the subtle tightening of his jaw suggested he was taking the girl's words seriously. "Did you get a good look at him? Could you describe his face?" the agent asked, his voice less gentle than Melania's but not unkind. Lila shook her head. "No, he had a hood on. I only saw him from the side when he stood up, but he was tall, and he had something like a scar near his mouth. I don't know, maybe a mark." The agent nodded, making a note of her description. Meanwhile, Melania knelt down slightly, bringing herself to Lila's eye level again. Why didn't you just walk away, Lila? Why did you stay and warn me? The girl hesitated, her eyes darting to the ground. I don't know, she admitted quietly. I couldn't. It felt wrong. Like if I didn't say something bad was going to happen. I don't know why, but I couldn't let you get in that car. There was a raw honesty in her words, the kind that was impossible to fake. Melania felt a pang of something she hadn't expected, gratitude. Yes, but also a deep sense of compassion for this child who had risked so much to warn her. Before she could respond, one of the agents approached, his expression grave. Ma'am, we've confirmed there was an unauthorized device attached to the vehicle. It's being handled, but we need to move you to a secure location immediately. The announcement sent another wave of murmurs through the remaining crowd. Some people tried to inch closer, straining to catch a glimpse of the vehicle or hear more of what was happening. The agents quickly closed ranks around Melania, preparing to escort her away. But Melania didn't move. Instead, she turned back to Lila. You're coming with us, she said firmly. Lila's eyes widened. Me? She asked, pointing at herself as though she couldn't believe it. Yes, you, Melania said with a small smile. You helped me today. Now let me help you. The agents exchanged wary glances but didn't argue. Melania's tone left no room for debate. Within minutes, they were whisked away in a different vehicle, leaving behind a crowd of bewildered onlookers and countless unanswered questions. As the car sped through the city streets, Lila sat quietly, her small hands clutching the edge of the seat. She had never been in a car like this before. So clean, so quiet, so unlike the noisy buses or beat-up taxis she'd occasionally seen. Melania sat beside her, her expression thoughtful. Do you have anyone, Lila? Family? Someone who looks after you? She asked gently. Lila shook her head. No, it's just me. The answer wasn't surprising, but it still tugged at Melania's heart. How long have you been on your own? She asked. I don't know, Lila said, her voice barely audible. A long time. Melania didn't press further, sensing that the girl wasn't ready to share more. Instead, she reached out and gently placed a hand on Lila's. You're not alone anymore, she said softly. Lila looked up at her, her eyes filled with an emotion she couldn't quite name. For the first time in as long as she could remember, she felt something other than fear or loneliness. It was faint, but it was there, hope. As they drove on, the city lights blurring past the windows, the tension from earlier still lingered in the air. The mystery of the device on the car, the identity of the man Lila had seen, and the question of why it had all happened remained unresolved. But one thing was clear. Lila's warning had saved the day, and her life was about to change in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The silence inside the vehicle was heavy, punctuated only by the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of a radio as the security team coordinated from their convoy. Lila sat stiffly, unsure of what to do with herself in such unfamiliar surroundings. She kept glancing out the window, watching the city rush past in a blur of neon signs and glowing streetlights. She wondered where they were going and why Melania had brought her along. Melania sat beside her, her phone in hand as she exchanged quiet words with someone on the other end of the line. Though her tone remained calm, there was a certain sharpness to it, a sense of urgency that she couldn't completely mask. Lila didn't try to listen in, but her curiosity was hard to ignore. She felt like a tiny piece in a much larger puzzle, one she didn't fully understand. The SUV turned down a quieter road, heading toward a private residence. Lila's eyes widened as they pulled up to a gated property. The house beyond the gates was massive, its lights glowing warmly against the dark sky. She had never seen anything like it, not in real life. The closest she had come was staring at the glossy pages of discarded magazines she sometimes found in trash bins. As they passed through the gates and came to a stop, Lila hesitated. She didn't belong here. Everything about this place felt too polished, too perfect. Her instincts told her to slip away, to vanish before anyone could realize she didn't fit. But Melania's reassuring presence kept her rooted. Inside, the house was just as grand as Lila had imagined. Vaulted ceilings, sparkling chandeliers, and floors so clean they reflected the light like mirrors. She shrank back slightly, afraid to touch anything. Melania guided her to a small sitting area, motioning for her to sit. You're safe here, Melania said, her voice kind but firm. I want you to relax. We'll talk soon. Lila nodded, though she wasn't sure how anyone could relax in a place like this. She perched on the edge of the plush sofa, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. Across the room, she caught glimpses of the security team speaking in hushed tones, their faces drawn with concentration. Whatever was going on, it wasn't over yet. Meanwhile, one of the agents approached Melania, handing her a tablet. We've pulled surveillance footage from the area around the vehicle, he said quietly. There's something you need to see. Melania's expression remained composed as she studied the screen, but a faint crease appeared between her brows. She motioned for the agent to step aside and followed him into a nearby room. Lila watched her go, a strange mix of anxiety and curiosity bubbling inside her. She wanted to know what they had found, but she also feared the answer. The minutes stretched on, each one feeling heavier than the last. When Melania finally returned, her face was unreadable. She glanced at Lila, then gestured for her to follow. Come with me, she said gently. Lila hesitated, but the look in Melania's eyes wasn't one of anger or impatience. It was understanding, maybe even concern. Slowly, she rose to her feet and followed her down a quiet hallway. They entered a small, cozy room that felt different from the rest of the house. It was still elegant, but it lacked the intimidating perfection of the main areas. There was a fire crackling in the corner, casting a warm glow across the space. Melania sat down in one of the armchairs and gestured for Lila to take the one across from her. Lila, Melania began, her tone soft but serious. We reviewed the footage. Everything you said was true. There was a man near the car, and he did place something there. Lila's heart raced. She had been so afraid no one would believe her, but now that they did, it felt even scarier. Do you know who he is? She asked quietly. Melania shook her head. Not yet, but we're working on it. The device he attached to the car has been safely removed, and my team is analyzing it. It might give us some answers. Lila bit her lip, 1,000 questions swirling in her mind. Do you think he wanted to hurt you? She asked hesitantly. Melania didn't answer right away. Instead, she leaned forward, her gaze steady. It's possible, she admitted. But what matters is that you warned us. You were brave, Lila. You might have saved lives today. Lila's cheeks flushed, and she looked down at her hands. She wasn't used to being called brave. Most of the time, she felt anything but. I didn't want anything bad to happen, she said softly. As the conversation unfolded, Melania couldn't help but notice the layers of complexity in the young girl before her. Lila was quiet but perceptive, shy yet remarkably courageous when it mattered most. It made Melania wonder what kind of life this child had lived to make her so attuned to danger. Meanwhile, in the secured command center set up in another part of the house, the security team worked tirelessly. The device recovered from the car was unlike anything they had seen before. It wasn't a bomb, as they had initially feared, but a sophisticated piece of technology designed to track and intercept signals. One agent frowned as he examined the data. This isn't just random, he muttered. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. Another agent nodded. It's targeted, no doubt about it. The question is why? And how did they know where she'd be? As they delved deeper, a troubling pattern began to emerge. The man Lila had seen near the car wasn't a stranger to them. His image had appeared in connection with other incidents involving high-profile figures, but his identity remained elusive. He was a ghost, careful, calculated, and always one step ahead. Back in the cozy room, Melania noticed Lila's eyelids growing heavy. The adrenaline that had kept her alert earlier was wearing off, leaving her visibly exhausted. You've had a long day, Melania said gently. Why don't you get some rest? We'll talk more in the morning. Lila hesitated, unsure how to respond. But the softness in Melania's voice and the genuine kindness in her eyes made her nod. For the first time in as long as she could remember, she felt safe enough to let her guard down, even if just for a little while. As the night wore on, questions lingered in the air, unanswered and unsettling. Who was the man that Lila had seen? What did he want? And how had a chance encounter with a young girl on the streets managed to unravel a plot that could have had devastating consequences? The pieces of the puzzle were still scattered, but one thing was clear. This was only the beginning. The quiet of the night was deceptive, a fragile stillness that felt like it could shatter at any moment. Lila had been shown to a small guest room, modest by the house's standards, but far more luxurious than anything she had ever experienced. She lay on the soft bed, staring up at the ceiling. Sleep should have come easily after the events of the day, but her mind refused to rest. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the man in the dark jacket, his movements swift and deliberate as he crouched near the SUV. In another part of the house, Melania sat in a private study, her security team gathered around her. The atmosphere was tense, the air thick with unspoken fears and unanswered questions. The head of her security team, a man named Harris, laid a tablet on the desk, its screen displaying a map with a cluster of red dots. "We've traced the signals from the device," Harris said, his voice low but firm. "It was transmitting data to multiple locations. Whoever set this up is part of a network, and they've been tracking your movements for weeks." Melania's jaw tightened, but she maintained her composure. "Do we know who's behind it?" she asked. Harris shook his head. "Not yet, but this isn't random. They've been watching you, planning this. The fact that we caught it in time might have thrown them off, but it won't stop them. They'll try again." Melania leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. She had faced threats before. It came with the territory of her position, but this felt different. It wasn't just her own safety at stake anymore. The thought of Lila, that brave little girl who had risked so much to warn her, filled her with a protective determination. "What about the man Lila saw?" she asked. "Do we have anything more on him?" Harris hesitated. "We're working on it. He's careful, but there are patterns. We think he might be connected to a larger organization. This wasn't a lone act." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Melania's eyes flicked to the window, where the faint glow of the city lights spilled into the room. Somewhere out there, someone was watching, waiting, and planning their next move. Meanwhile, Lila sat up in bed, unable to shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She had spent years learning to trust her instincts. On the streets, they were often the only thing standing between her and danger. Tonight, those instincts were screaming at her. She slipped out of bed and tiptoed to the door, opening it just enough to peer into the dimly lit hallway. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that felt unnatural. She hesitated, then stepped into the corridor, her bare feet barely making a sound against the polished floor. Lila didn't have a plan. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, but something pulled her forward. She wandered through the hallways, her small frame blending into the shadows. As she approached a corner, she heard voices, low and urgent. She froze, pressing herself against the wall to listen. "We need to move her to a safer location," Harris was saying. "This house isn't secure enough, not with the level of sophistication these people are operating with." Melania's voice followed, calm but resolute. "I'm not leaving her behind. Wherever I go, she goes." Lila's chest tightened. She hadn't realized until that moment just how much Melania's words would mean to her. For so long, she had felt invisible, unworthy of anyone's care or attention. But now, someone was standing up for her, refusing to leave her behind. Her thoughts were interrupted by a faint noise, a barely perceptible click coming from the far end of the hallway. She turned her head sharply, her heart pounding. It sounded like a door, but not one she recognized. The noise was so faint that anyone else might have dismissed it, but Lila's ears were attuned to the smallest sounds. Curiosity and fear warred within her, but her feet moved before her mind could decide. She crept toward the source of the sound, her small frame making it easy to stay hidden. As she rounded the corner, she spotted a figure slipping through a side door, their movements quick and deliberate. Her breath caught in her throat. It was the man from earlier, the one she had seen near the SUV. She was certain of it. His dark jacket and the way he moved were burned into her memory. Lila's first instinct was to run back and warn Melania, but something stopped her. If she left now, the man might disappear again, and they'd lose their chance to catch him. She clenched her fists, trying to summon the courage to follow. The man moved down a narrow staircase that Lila hadn't noticed before. She waited until he was out of sight, then crept after him, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure he would hear it. The staircase led to a lower level of the house, a place that felt colder, darker, and far less welcoming than the rest of the home. She pressed herself against the wall, peeking around the corner to see where the man had gone. He was at the far end of a corridor, crouched over what looked like a small device. Lila squinted, trying to make out what he was doing. It looked like he was attaching something to a fuse box, his hands moving with practiced precision. Panic surged through her. Whatever he was doing, it couldn't be good. She had to do something, but she was just a child. What could she possibly do against someone like him? Her mind raced, searching for a solution. Then she remembered the whistle in her pocket. A small, battered thing she had found weeks ago and kept for no particular reason. It wasn't much, but it might be enough to create a distraction. She pulled it out, her hands trembling, and raised it to her lips. Taking a deep breath, she blew as hard as she could. The sound was piercing, cutting through the silence like a blade. The man froze, his head snapping up in alarm. Lila didn't wait to see what he would do next. She turned and ran, her feet flying over the cold floor as she retraced her steps. Behind her, she heard the man shout, a harsh, angry sound that sent chills down her spine. But she didn't look back. All she could think about was getting to Melania, getting to safety. As she burst into the main hallway, she collided with Harris, who caught her by the shoulders. "What's going on?" he demanded, his voice sharp. "There's a man," Lila gasped, struggling to catch her breath. "He's in the basement. He's doing something to the fuse box." Harris didn't waste a second. He barked orders into his radio, and within moments, the house erupted into controlled chaos. Security agents moved swiftly, their weapons drawn, as they headed toward the basement. Lila clung to Melania, her small frame shaking with adrenaline and fear. Melania held her close, whispering words of comfort, even as her own eyes remained fixed on the hallway, waiting for news of what would happen next. The tension was palpable, every second stretching into an eternity. Whatever was about to happen, they all knew it would change everything. The air in the house felt charged with tension as the security team disappeared down the hallway, leaving Melania and Lila in the relative quiet of the main corridor. Lila's breathing was still uneven, her heart pounding in her chest. She clung to Melania's hand, the comfort of her presence keeping her grounded despite the storm of emotions swirling inside her. Melania knelt down, gently brushing a stray lock of hair from Lila's face. "You did the right thing," she said softly. "You were brave and you warned us in time. Now we just need to stay calm and let the team handle this." Lila nodded, though her body still trembled with the aftershocks of fear. Before she could respond, the faint sound of shouting echoed from the direction of the basement. Melania's posture stiffened, her eyes narrowing as she strained to listen. The voices were muffled, but the urgency in their tones was unmistakable. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Lila clung to Melania's side, her small hands clutching the fabric of her sleeve as if it were a lifeline. The distant sounds grew louder, footsteps pounding against the floor, sharp commands cutting through the silence. And then, a sudden, deafening silence. Melania's security team emerged from the hallway moments later, their expressions grim. Harris stepped forward, his face set in a mask of professionalism, though there was a flicker of something darker in his eyes. "We secured the man," he said, his tone measured but taut. He was trying to install a secondary device. This one was more dangerous than the first, a disruptor meant to interfere with communications and trigger a larger system remotely. Melania's expression didn't waver, but Lila could feel the tension radiating from her. "Did he say anything?" Melania asked, her voice steady. Harris hesitated, a shadow passing over his face. "Not much." He refused to give his name or explain his motives. "But we found something on him. Something you need to see." He gestured for Melania to follow, and she gave Lila's hand a reassuring squeeze before rising to her feet. "Stay here," she said gently. "I'll be right back." Lila nodded, though she hated being left behind. Her instincts told her that whatever they had found would only make things more complicated. In the study, Harris handed Melania a small object wrapped in plastic. It was a photograph, creased and worn as though it had been handled many times. Melania's breath caught as she looked at the image. It was of her, taken months ago at a public event. She was standing on a stage, smiling at the crowd, unaware that someone in the audience had been watching her with far darker intentions. "What else did you find?" Melania asked, her voice low. Harris shifted uneasily. There were coordinates written on the back of the photo. "They lead to a remote location outside the city. a warehouse that's been flagged in connection with illegal operations. We believe it's their base of operations. Melania's mind raced. This wasn't just about the device or the man they had captured. This was part of something much larger, a plan that was still in motion. We need to act quickly, she said. If this warehouse is connected, it might hold the answers we're looking for, and the people behind all of this. Harris nodded, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. It's a risk, he said. They might be expecting us. Melania met his gaze, her expression resolute. I'm willing to take that risk. Back in the sitting room, Lila sat alone, her mind buzzing with unanswered questions. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than anyone realized. Her instincts, honed by years of surviving on the streets, told her that the danger wasn't over. Her thoughts were interrupted by a faint sound, a subtle creak, like the floorboards shifting under someone's weight. She froze, her ears straining to pinpoint the source. The house was supposed to be secure, but something about the sound set her nerves on edge. Lila slipped off the sofa, her movements careful and silent. She crept toward the door, peeking into the hallway. At first, she saw nothing, but as her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she spotted a shadow moving at the far end of the corridor. It wasn't one of the security team members. Their movements were always purposeful and controlled. This figure moved with a different kind of intent, quiet, predatory. Her heart raced as she ducked back into the room, pressing herself against the wall. She knew she needed to warn Melania, but she didn't know how to get to her without being seen. The figure was getting closer, the sound of their footsteps growing louder. Lila's mind raced, searching for a way out. Then she remembered the small side door she had seen earlier, the one the man had used to access the basement. It might be risky, but it was her best chance. She slipped out of the room, moving as quickly and quietly as she could. Her small size made it easier to stay hidden, but every step felt like a gamble. She reached the side door and pushed it open, her heart pounding as she stepped into the dark corridor beyond. The shadowy figure turned the corner just as the door clicked shut behind her, their eyes narrowing as they scanned the empty room. Lila didn't stop to catch her breath. She ran down the corridor, her footsteps light against the cold floor. She didn't know where she was going, but every instinct told her to keep moving. Somewhere deep inside, she knew that the answers and the danger were closer than anyone realized. Lila's feet barely touched the ground as she sprinted down the narrow corridor, the sound of footsteps just behind her urging her on. Her mind raced, but she couldn't afford to let fear control her. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to get as far away as possible, but something deeper, the same thing that had kept her alive on the streets for years, pushed her forward. She wasn't about to let someone else control her life, not again. The corridor twisted, leading her to a small staircase at the end. It spiraled downward, into what seemed like the heart of the house, dark, damp, and silent. But Lila knew it was a trap. The sound of footsteps echoed closer, and she could feel the man's presence in the air, like a shadow stalking her every move. She didn't have much time. Reaching the bottom of the stairs, Lila threw open the door to a large, cold room filled with old machinery, crates stacked haphazardly, and shadows that danced with the flickering light from the exposed bulbs overhead. She moved quickly, weaving between the crates, her breath shallow. The walls felt like they were closing in on her, the weight of the situation making her head spin. But then, just as she rounded a corner, she collided with someone. It was the man, the one from the basement. He had cornered her. Lila stumbled back, fear momentarily paralyzing her, but she quickly regained her composure. She wasn't going down without a fight. Her eyes darted around for anything that could help, but the room was sparse. Her heart raced as she realized the man was only a few feet away now, his face obscured by a mask. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if he were savoring the moment. "I thought you'd be more careful, little girl," the man said, his voice low and mocking. Lila didn't respond. She couldn't afford to show weakness. Instead, she lunged, using the only weapon she had, her own body. She shoved the man with all her might, sending him off balance for just a moment. That moment was all she needed. She dashed for the nearest exit, a small door at the far end of the room. But as she reached for the handle, a loud bang echoed through the room. The door slammed shut before she could escape, and the man's laughter followed, cold and unnerving. Lila spun around, panic clawing at her throat. He was getting closer again. But then, the sound of multiple footsteps echoed from the far side of the room. It was the security team. They burst through the door just as the man advanced, their guns raised. Harris led the charge, his face set in a determined expression. "Get down!" Harris barked. Lila didn't hesitate. She dropped to the floor, covering her head as gunfire erupted. The man tried to react, but it was too late. He was hit, falling to the ground with a grunt of pain. The room fell silent again, save for the heavy breathing of the security team. Harris moved swiftly, checking the man for any weapons before cuffing him. "It's over," he muttered. "You're done." Lila remained on the floor for a moment, her hands shaking as she tried to process what had just happened. It wasn't until she felt Melania's hand on her shoulder that she finally stood up, looking into her eyes. "You're safe now," Melania said, her voice warm but filled with a hint of exhaustion. Lila didn't know what to say. For the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't sure if words could even capture what she was feeling. Relief, fear, confusion, all of it tangled inside her. But as Harris moved to pull the mask off the man, something strange happened. The man's face was no longer unfamiliar. It was someone Lila had seen before, though she couldn't quite place where. His eyes were cold and calculating, but there was a flicker of recognition behind them. Lila's stomach dropped. "Wait," she whispered. "Who is he?" Harris looked down at the man, his expression changing as he pulled back further. The man was no ordinary figure. His face was heavily scarred, but beneath the marks was a distinct feature that Lila had seen on someone else just a few hours earlier, another man who had been part of the team watching her. The realization hit her like a punch in the gut. This isn't just one person," Lila stammered. "He's working with someone on the inside. One of your people, Melania." Melania's face went pale. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice shaking. Lila turned to her, her eyes wide with panic. "The man who was in the SUV, he was one of them. This guy, he's been feeding them information. Whoever is behind this, they've had a mole inside your security the whole time." A silence fell over the room, heavy and suffocating. The gravity of Lila's words hit everyone at once. Harris's expression darkened as he stared at the man on the floor, his mind racing to make the connection. "Check the records," Harris said abruptly, his voice tight. "Now!" Melania's security team quickly filed out of the room, headed for their headquarters to dig deeper into their personnel records. But Melania stayed behind, her gaze fixed on the man as the weight of the new revelation settled over her. "This wasn't just an isolated attempt," she said, her voice quieter now. "This has been planned for months, maybe longer. Someone has been manipulating us from the inside." Lila felt a chill run down her spine. There was no telling who they could trust now. The walls of the mansion, once a symbol of safety and security, suddenly felt like a trap. Whoever was behind this had been playing them all along. And yet, despite the uncertainty, there was a spark of determination in Melania's eyes. "We'll find them," she said, "and we'll stop them." But as they stood there, the sound of a phone ringing broke the silence. Melania pulled out her phone, her eyes scanning the caller ID. When she answered, her face shifted, her eyes widening in shock as she listened intently. Lila's stomach twisted. Whatever Melania was hearing wasn't good. She watched as Melania's face drained of color, her hands trembling slightly. "They're still coming," Melania whispered. "This wasn't the end. It's just the beginning." And in that moment, Lila realized the stakes were much higher than she could have ever imagined. Whatever game they were all part of, it was far from over. The real battle had only just begun. The phone call felt like a weight hanging over them, the tension palpable in the air. Melania's face had gone pale as she listened to the voice on the other end, the urgency clear in her voice as she asked a series of questions. Lila could see her processing the information, trying to piece together what was happening. Finally, Melania ended the call, and silence followed as she let out a slow breath. "They're moving fast," she said, turning toward the security team. "We need to get to that warehouse now. It's the only lead we have left." Lila, still processing the shock of the revelation, nodded. She couldn't shake the feeling that things were only going to get more complicated. The realization that someone in Melania's inner circle had been betraying them was a bitter pill to swallow. How had they missed it? How had they allowed themselves to be played for so long? The idea that she could trust no one left a gnawing ache in her stomach. But Melania didn't hesitate. She didn't have the luxury of doubt. "Gather everyone," she ordered, her voice steady, even as her eyes burned with determination. "We move out in 5 minutes." The team scrambled into action, gathering weapons and equipment as they prepared for the next phase of the mission. Lila, despite her nerves, was determined to stay close to Melania. She had been part of this journey from the beginning, and she wasn't about to back out now. She had a purpose now, something larger than herself to focus on. The drive to the warehouse was tense. Lila sat in the back of the convoy, watching the streets fly by as the team kept a sharp lookout for any signs of trouble. Melania sat in the front, her phone in hand, constantly checking in with her team on the ground. Despite everything that had happened, despite the betrayal they had just uncovered, there was a cool professionalism in the way Melania led. It was something Lila admired. As they neared the warehouse district, the streets grew quieter. The city felt eerily still, as if it were holding its breath in anticipation of what was to come. The convoy slowed as they reached the entrance to the warehouse complex. It was a nondescript building, hidden among others just like it, and if you didn't know what you were looking for, you might never guess it housed the heart of the conspiracy they had been unraveling. The team disembarked quickly, taking up positions around the perimeter of the warehouse. Lila's heart pounded in her chest as she followed Melania and Harris toward the entrance. Her mind was still racing. What were they about to find inside? Who could they trust now? As they entered, the air was thick with dust and the faint smell of oil and metal. The silence was deafening. Every footstep echoed against the concrete floor as they made their way deeper into the building. The only sound was the hum of machinery in the distance, as though the warehouse had once been used for something else entirely. They reached the center of the room, and then it happened, an explosion. A blinding flash of light followed by a deafening roar. Lila was thrown backward, her body slamming against the cold floor. For a split second, she thought she might have been knocked unconscious, but then she heard voices shouting, yelling. Chaos erupted all around her. She struggled to get to her feet, disoriented and dizzy from the blast. When her vision cleared, she saw Melania, still standing, her face a mask of fury and resolve. A small group of their team had been hit, but they were alive, scrambling to regroup. Harris barked orders, his calm voice cutting through the panic. Lila's heart raced as she caught sight of the man in the mask, the one who had been part of the team. He was standing near the back of the room, a detonator in his hand. The same man who had betrayed them all. The same man who had set this entire nightmare in motion. "I knew you'd come for me," he sneered, a malicious grin on his face. "But it's too late. You're already too late." Lila felt a surge of anger flood her chest, but she couldn't afford to let it take over. There was still time, but they had to act fast. She looked at Melania, who nodded once, silent understanding passing between them. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The next few moments were a blur of movement. Harris and the team rushed forward, attempting to disarm the trap and take down the traitor. Gunfire echoed through the space as Melania moved toward the man. Lila was close behind, watching as the team closed in on him. The stakes had never been higher, and yet there was something in Melania's calm focus that gave Lila a sense of hope, however fleeting. The traitor turned to run, but it was too late. He had underestimated the precision of Melania's team. With a single, calculated movement, they incapacitated him. The detonator slipped from his hand as he crumpled to the ground. But even as the man was captured, Lila couldn't shake the feeling that the danger wasn't truly gone. This had been only one piece of the puzzle, a single thread in a much larger web. And even as the traitor was dragged away, she couldn't help but wonder what other forces were still at play. Back in the car on the drive back to the mansion, the weight of what they had just experienced settled over Lila like a blanket. They had stopped one threat, but the world they lived in was more dangerous than she had ever imagined. As Melania sat next to her, her eyes reflecting the faint glow of the streetlights outside, Lila couldn't help but ask the question that had been nagging at her since they left the warehouse. "Do you think it's really over?" she asked softly. Melania didn't look at her right away. She seemed lost in thought, her fingers lightly tapping the side of the car door. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, though tinged with a sadness Lila hadn't noticed before. "It's never really over," she said, "but we're still standing, and that's all that matters." Lila nodded, feeling the weight of her words settle in. The world might never be safe, might never be as simple as she had once hoped. But there was strength in survival. There was power in not giving up. And as the car sped through the city, Lila realized that no matter what came next, she had found something she hadn't had in a long time, a reason to fight.